All right, we talked a little bit about these documentation requirements a little bit earlier, so this section I'm going to skip through pretty quickly. It's very typical. It's what your accounting department is currently doing. You keep receipts, contracts, leases, vendor invoices, and the like. The tricky part gets to personnel documentation, and I want to find a slide, and this is the slide I'm looking for. When we have somebody that fits one of these bulleted activities is when all that requirement about time documentation comes into play. So it's somebody who works on 2 or more federal awards, a federally funded activity and a non-federally funded activity, a direct activity or an indirect activity. Building maintenance would be an example of an indirect, perhaps, activity. 2 or more indirect activities that are allocated using different allocation bases. Forget that bullet point. That will not come up in 99.9% of rural transit agencies, public or otherwise. An unallowable activity, which is typically fundraising. Fundraising is not an allowable activity. If you're a nonprofit organization, you may depend on fundraising. It's a very meaningful activity. It's probably a prominent part of certainly the executive director's job duties. It's just simply the feds aren't going to pay for it. So you guys have to, that's considered an unallowable activity. And then if some other portion of the ED salary is direct, it's going to trigger that an executive director to fall into this category. And I just told that guy not to call me. So this is when we trigger, and if you didn't recognize, I'm a little bit of a Seinfeld buff. You know, that's the ringtone from his theme from Seinfeld. When any of those situations apply, we've got to keep that special documentation that's got to reasonably reflect my total activity. So if I'm split between 2 of these activities from the previous slide, it's not good enough that on my day at a glance pad on my desk, I write down 2 hours today for transit, 4 hours tomorrow on transit. It's got to reflect all 8 hours of my day. It's got to reflect 100% of the time of my compensated activities. So I said earlier, all 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 160 hours a month.
There's no overtime?
Yeah, overtime if you're salaried, if you're an hourly employee. One of the things that I sometimes hear is people object that saying that this violates the Fair Labor Standards Act because salaried employees are not entitled to overtime, and therefore how do they meet this requirement if they have to, if an hourly employee has to work overtime, etc. And there is, and that was always a question. In the Super Circular, OMB says, look, we've talked to the Labor Department about this. Nothing violates your standing as a salaried employee by keeping this time record. One of the things people used to do to avoid paying overtime is to tell you you're salaried and then actually pay you on an hourly basis. And this is the way they would try to circumvent DOL oversight. And so generally, we learned that in the 30s and 40s. We don't do that anymore. And some people were recalling that period and saying this is just reminiscent of you trying to circumvent Fair Labor Standards Act requirements. Not true. There is a little articulation that this isn't a violation if a salaried employee keeps a time record to meet this requirement. So it really doesn't matter what your pay basis is, and it's just you simply cannot bill a federal grant award based on an estimate of time in any way, shape, or form. So my earlier example about I'm an executive director of a small nonprofit, and I manage 3 federally financed programs. And as a consequence, I bill the executive director's salary 33% to program A, 33% to program B, et cetera. You cannot do that. That's never been permissible. The super circular doesn't change anything in that regard. It's the way it's always been, but a lot of people bill time that way, and that is not allowable. Budget estimates, which is what percentages are considered to be, do not qualify as support for charges to federal awards. Can you use them for developing the grant budget? Absolutely. But when it comes time to actually billing for that time, it's got to be actual after the fact activity.
Question.
Yes,
Can you use salaries as a, like an in-kind or a local match?
absolutely.
But you wouldn't bill for it?
That is correct. If you're proposing, if you're using salaries as local match, you would have to do several things. One, has to be that use of local match has to be approved by the funding source. Two, it couldn't be, the salary of that proposed match couldn't be supported by any other federal money or you'd violate the double dipping standard. Three, match requirements are subject to the same allowability standards as if you were billing it directly. So if it was a portion of the salary being used as match, that individual would have to keep up with the necessary documentation to support his or her salary. I think those would be the limiting conditions.
Rich, I just want to say GDOT does not allow in-kind match at this time with the 5311 program.
Yeah, in terms of, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, when we talk about contributions of services, there's so-called in-kind. Technically in the super circular, there's no such thing as in-kind. There's contributions and there's donations. And each of those two are subject to their own unique provisions we'll talk about later today. Generally, in-kind, I know we use that terminology in grants management forever and a day, and it usually means we don't really have the money to match this grant, so we're getting creative. And I've snowballed somebody at the federal level to let me do it. And it technically, from the super circular's perspective, it's not allowable because one, what I would hang my hat on the unallowability provision is the general costs of local government are not allowable. And so now I'm proposing the cost of a local government employee to be used as local match. The local government costs cannot be used as, it's not allowable. And since match is subject to the same allowability criteria as direct billed cost, we couldn't do that. So generally, in-kind salaries couldn't be done. When contributions of labor are made by outside parties, though, that's a different situation because that gets us into a contribution, not an in-kind scenario. And I'll tell you how you could do it that way later on this afternoon. All right. The other thing I hear, and I haven't mentioned this excuse yet in terms of percentages, is that some people say, well, we base our billing to the grant on time studies. And that always piques my interest. And I ask, well, tell me about that time study. Because I'm going to put it side by side against what the federal requirements are. And I'll let you guys be the judge. And what I'll hear when I ask that question is that, well, our executive director took a sample back in July of 2014, and for 2 weeks she kept up with everything she did. And we use that as a basis, whatever those percentages were, we use that as a basis for billing today. That's not allowable. Let's talk about what the feds want to do on personnel, what they will call a substitute system. Number one, the sampling methodology has to be statistically significant, literally blessed by a college professor. It has to include every employee subject to the allocation. So if 5 employees are distributing their time on these allocations that the executive director did in the 2-week period, that would fail this test immediately because all 5 employees weren't included in the sample. It has to include all 365 days of the year. A random sample isn't random if it's 2 weeks in July. That's not random. It's like drug and alcohol test. I saw an audit from HHS dinging New Jersey Medicaid because their personnel were based on a random moment sampling basis. They had the professor's signature on the sampling, but because they failed to include Saturdays in the sample draw period, HHS auditors disallowed the sample, disallowed every employee's time who was billed on the sample percentages, and wanted New Jersey to pay CMS $1 million for some salaried employees who billed their time that way. So again, the feds don't have much of a sense of humor on this stuff. I've never encountered a nonprofit who told me they billed on a percentage basis who could meet this criteria. It's just not worth it. You got to keep the documentation. That's just all there is to it.